Hey,
Hi, how's it going?
good. How are you?
Oh, not too bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to run right at 5:15.
Yeah, or like
At least
five.
there's no commuting time.
Yeah, that's Zoom to another Zoom.
Yeah, I've been in um one after another today. I'm kind of zoomed out. Hi.
Hey,
Hi.
I can't hear.
Oh,
Oh, can you hear?
yeah.
Okay. Can everyone hear? Any luck?
I'm here. Can you see
Hear
me?
us?
We can see you. Yeah, and your voice is coming through slowly. Are you on the Zoom app or through the web?
I'm through this Hoova thing, but I could go to the Zoom app. Would that
I
be
would,
easy?
yeah, I think that works a little better.
Is there a link for that somewhere?
I think
Or
if you just copy let me just go back to the Wova page.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
oh, that's a good idea because I don't think it was. Let me do it. Yeah, I'd rather do it with Zoom.
I'll put it in.
Okay, I'm in Tennessee, by the way. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so it's in this chat. Okay, well, it's not.
Oh,
Yeah.
doesn't
Can you
show
put
up.
it in the Hoova chat, or are you in Zoom? Are you in Zoom?
I'm
Yeah.
in Zoom, but I can go back to the Hoover chat if you guys want to start chatting, and I can go back to the Hoover.
Okay. Anyway, no, I was interested in this because in Tennessee, they are not open, the death records.
Hmm.
And, I didn't even realize that. Fix them. See, we're just sitting here at home, so we're not like dressed up to be in these rooms.
No.
What? They're going to see us? Anyway, but anyway, I don't even know when that got passed, and I know I should look up the legislative history. I should tell you who I am. I'm Deborah Fisher. I'm the director of the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government. And we've been around since 2003, and we do lots of advocacy at the legislature. And I've been doing advocacy at the legislature since about 2014. And it's, learning as I go, partly, but I will tell you, I've had a lot of uh, how this came to my knowledge about the death records was when they were trying to shut down the autopsy reports. And we're like, our autopsy reports are open. I kept saying these are public autopsies, not government autopsies. And they said, well, the death records are closed. And I'm like, they are? I'm on Ancestry.com and I get all this death record stuff, death certificates and so I'm not exactly sure when it happened. So I'm just curious how in the world we even work to get that changed. And I mean, they seem the idea of private information about an individual who died and protecting, protecting the information about what was the cause of death of someone. The lawmakers that I talk to, they don't want to change that at all. But I think about it like it used to be open. Why is it an issue now? So I'm just interested in your thoughts since I have to advocate and what kind of approach might work.
Sure. So we categorize Tennessee as one of our sort of medium open states because you can get death records without being a direct descendant, but you can't get any useful information off of them, like cause of death.
Yeah,
So it's like,
yeah,
oh, thanks for the records. They don't actually tell us anything,
yeah.
which
It
is
has a date, right? It's just basically the date.
so I think to the question of why that changed, why they would have been open or more open before than they are now. When genealogy websites came along, a lot of states enacted some laws to make sure that the genealogists couldn't get a hold of private information about recently deceased people. In a lot of states, that looks like putting a 75-year hold on death records.
Mm-hmm.
which makes them, again, pretty useless in present. In Tennessee, they don't have, as far as I recall, they don't have the several year hold. But again, you'll never be able to get that redacted information back off of there. So, as to your question of what we can do about it, basically what we proposed is working with groups like yours, having journalists in your state become involved, and kind of banding together to create or draft legislation that could be modeled off of legislation in those 12 open states. I will say, even in the open states, the legislation isn't perfect. It doesn't guarantee that that officials across the board will adhere to the law in the same way, as with every FOIA law, obviously. But there are at least states where, as long as people are complying, or if you sue them enough, you will be able to get the information. So we're going to try to publicize some of our findings for this, and hopefully get more groups like yours on board so that we can possibly all meet together and try to draft legislation that would make sense. At a federal level isn't going to happen, but at a state by state level, and we can start in states like yours where the laws are already okay, but not great.
And I'll just add a little bit in that we discovered that there is a trade association that was the one that went around the country lobbying for these closure of records. And unfortunately, there was nobody there to fight against them. And part of it is that they make money off of selling the records to people who do have authority to get them. That trade association's president has now been on the record saying to genealogy groups, at least, that their position has changed 180 degrees and that they now suggest a 0-year hold on death records, including the cause of death, because their research has shown that the concerns, they got closed for 2 reasons. One was, will people be embarrassed by a relative's cause of death? Drug overdoses. At the time that this became popular, it was AIDS. And the other reason that they always bring up in these hearings is the possibility for identity theft by getting records. What their research at this trade association has shown is that, number one, the public couldn't care less about whether people can get your death records. And in fact, sometimes it's useful because close friends of the family can then find out what happened without having to bother the family, right? Like, so that there are even some reasons why people might want them open, but that in general, there has like never been a complaint about releasing a cause of death. It was an assumption that people would be upset. And the second reason is they don't have any cases of any problems with identity theft. So the 2 reasons of keeping them closed were all based on assumptions and not based on research in any way. Megan, do you remember the name of that association?
Yeah, I was just looking it up. NAPSIS, which is the National Association for Public Health Statistics and Information Systems.
Did you say Nexus? Nexus, as in LexisNexis?
No, NAPSIS.
NAPSIS, sorry.
Oh.
National Association for Public Health Statistics and Information Systems.
And it is an association of every public health department in the country, every state public health department in the country that lobbies for, and what they do is they do the thing like they do the national system for death records, and they do a couple of other things that they make money off of if states use their system. I think something like 48 states use their system. And so they have become the de facto people who both recommend and are the gatekeepers for death certificates. Any vital records, but death certificates in particular.
And so they've switched their position and think they need to be open?
Mm-hmm. That's what we understand.
And they are the ones that got them closed. You say it happened in the 80s?
80s and 90s.
During the AIDS. And okay, well, yeah, if you get together a group of coalitions and states to talk about it, I would love to learn more about it. I mean, it is hard to open something that has been closed because it's really an uphill battle. And we have to have the right sort of arguments. We can't just say, well, they were closed and nobody had complained about it. You know, that works if I would have been there, or we would have been there when they were closing them. We maybe could have stopped it. But
But there, I think that we now, one of the reasons we did this paper, and Rhonda, I'm sorry, is that how you say your name? Rhonda?
me,
I
me?
just want to make sure you know that we'll call you, we'll be done in a second and
Yeah,
get to your
it's
question.
Brenda. I don't know if you can hear me.
And
Can you hear me?
yes.
Kind of, yeah. It's a little delayed on my end.
So let me just finish this thought and then we'll get to your question. I didn't want you to think we were ignoring you. Um, but the idea is that I think that this group has now found, we have now discovered the benefits of open records. And if, you know, and I think that there are a lot of, this is just my sense, there are a lot of public health people out there right now who are pretty pissed off about not being able to get death records surrounding COVID. And it's not just us who can't get them. And particularly getting anonymous death records should be much easier than they are. But right now they're treated as if they're medical records. And,
Exactly.
and that is like, there are a lot of researchers and a lot of public policy people and mayors and people like that who can't find out enough detail about the deaths in their areas related to COVID. So we decided to do this paper because this is a moment where people might actually care about opening them. So.
Well, count us in if you do another kind of Zoom call. I know you're only here for 30 minutes, so
okay,
get out of your way. But definitely,
okay,
Deborah
good.
Fisher, Tennessee.
Great.
Okay.
Rhonda?
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, hi. So my name is Randa. I'm a student in the journalism school of the University of Arizona. And I read the paper. It was very interesting. But I had some questions. So if you want access to death records, is it mainly for journalists or for the public in general? Because there would be a difference.
So our argument would be for the public in general, because I'm speaking really out of turn on behalf of Sarah right now, but I would say that I would say that we would argue that the reason journalists want public access and need public access is so that the public can have information. So there would be no reason we would see to restrict opening access to journalists and not the entire public. Just sort of taking out the middleman. It's just that the public doesn't generally request large scale records like this. So it wouldn't, it would certainly be to the benefit of journalists as well in doing our jobs.
Do you feel like there should be a solution or something that satisfies both sides, the government and the public, whereas like to protect identity theft, to protect, you know, concerns that let's say I have something who passed away in my family. I don't want another relative to access the records of the person who passed away in my family and see why they passed away, and you know, some information that can be private. So do you think there can be a solution that satisfies both sides of the story or the argument?
There could be. I mean, I think, and Megan, you should correct me if I'm wrong about this. And I know you have to go in like 1 minute.
I'm so sorry. I'm about to ditch out of this session.
She has to go teach a class, so I'm going to finish up. Oh, I'll ask you about this later in case. But I mean, there are two ways of doing it. Sometimes what they do with hospital records, as an example, not hospital records, but some other records, is that you get some types of information with names on them. For instance, the name, date of death, and the location of death, maybe the zip code, their last zip code. Or you get anonymous with the causes of death, and that you have to agree not to try to identify the people using the causes of death. So that works in some cases. I mean, the other thing to do is to say, we just haven't, there is no evidence that the families are seeking to be shielded by this. That it's not something that a lot of people have said, oh, I don't want. For instance, in the states where it's public, there is no evidence that any families have ever complained about being able to get other people being able to get causes of death. And so it was brought up in anticipation that families would care, but it turns out they don't, at least in the states where it's open. So the issue has always been that the laws were passed based on assumptions as opposed to based on evidence.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you.
Sebastian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, hi. I'm also in Ron Ruth's class at the University of Arizona. I was just wondering if before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a push for death records for other, trying to write other stories and things like that. But do you think that the pandemic has really brought to the forefront why these death records are so important? Like, it just seems like a turning point in this type of FOI research.
Well, that was what prompted us to look into it, was that it has been a long-standing and frankly puzzling kind of problem. Until the 90s or so, nobody ever thought of death as a secret activity, right? It was considered a public thing, and that dead people had no privacy rights. And suddenly every state started closing down their records. So it's been kind of this rolling problem for a huge amount of time. Part of the paper that Megan and Madeline wrote, Jody and I kind of got it started, and they actually did the work. That they wrote goes through a lot of the stories that were done prior to COVID that couldn't be done in other cities because of it, because of these restrictions, and the kinds of important stories that are done all the time in states like Michigan, where you can get death records, and states where you can't. But all we can say is that we agree with your premise, and that was what prompted us to try to do a little research on this, and to start kind of hopefully making a movement to try to get things opened up, because I think we're all realizing now with COVID that this has now gone too far, and we can't get basic information about our communities. I would argue that we might have known a lot more about the opioid crisis a lot earlier if more states had more open death records. When you're dependent on 10 states to be the place where you learn about this, and you don't have journalists and the public going through death records on a regular basis in their communities, I argue that we might have had a handle on the opioid crisis much earlier.
Sarah,
That's
thank you so much for
interesting.
doing this.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's one thing I really enjoyed about the piece was the use of examples to illustrate, previous instances where death record access was so critical. And one thing I was just a little bit confused about was, where did the misconception of identity theft come from, and how did that become a basis for restricting death records?
First, Frank, did you have a comment? I'll address it in a sec.
No, please answer that one. I'm fascinated to hear that one, and then I'll ask mine.
Well, I've looked through some of the testimony. There became this kind of frenzy of identity theft right around the mid 90s, right? It was when the Driver Protection Act was passed by Congress, and it never had a lot of basis in fact. It kind of gave cover to people who wanted to close records anyway. And it was such a frightening thing that people kind of believed it. But frankly, this same trade association that is now saying that death records ought to be open was the one, if you go to their website, they say protecting personal privacy. That is their mission. And protecting personal identity. I mean, they were the ones that went around the country to every legislature and argued that this could be a route to identity theft and that they should be closed. And I think the other thing that happened was actually birth records did become a route to identity theft. Like, open death records prevent identity theft. Open birth records can open the door to identity theft. So I think they got all mixed up with all vital records, not separating out birth from death.
Oh, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. Because that's what I was thinking was that, stealing the identity of someone who's dead would be much more difficult if the death record is
Right.
available
Right. So
versus it being
that
closed.
scam of finding somebody who died and then stealing their identity would be a lot harder if everybody could find out that they were dead. Right. So it's like,
Yeah.
so that whole problem kind of got all mushed up with birth records and marriage records and divorce records and adoption records and all of these other things that are a little bit more, that there might be a little bit more, there might be more basis, although I don't know that there's any research that supports any of it. We couldn't find any research that even addressed, in any kind of standard way, not only whether it ever happened, but even what the definition of identity theft is. So we can't figure out, I mean, it seems that phrase, identity theft, can just be, I'm old enough to remember what happened to public records after 9/11. And I remember somebody going to a conference, somebody who from the Justice Department going to a conference and saying, you can't just wave a flag and say 9/11 and close records, right? You can't do that. And I feel like they just waved a flag and said identity theft and closed the records.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I apologize if this was asked before I joined the meeting, but because of the timing of the early 90s being kind of when we saw the movement to close down access, did your research at all suggest any cause and effect with AIDS? Because AIDS is the one cause of death, right, that at least at that time in our society carried a unique stigma associated with it. Not nearly the same stigma now, but at least in the sort of, mid 80s to into the 90s, right, there was a stigma that, oh, you're either an IV drug user or you're a closet homosexual. And so I wonder if those two things had any cause and effect.
Well, I always thought that. And part of it is because I spent most of my career in DC. And in DC, they specifically identified AIDS. When they closed death records in DC, they specifically identified AIDS as a cause of death that they didn't want families to have publicized. But when we went back and looked, and that was just from my memory of what happened. But when we went back and looked, it was more about drugs than it was about AIDS. It was more about drug overdoses, alcoholism, things like that. We did not find specific references to AIDS, but my recollection when they were all being closed was that it was prompted by AIDS. It may be that it was prompted by AIDS, but they never said so. And so I don't know, but I get what you're saying there, because that was my recollection about it as well. When I started reporting in the early 90s, like they had just started closing down a lot of them. And my sense of the causes of death, at the time, the death records themselves were still open. The other thing that's odd about that is that in most states, not all of them, in most states, coroner's records or medical examiner records are still open. And any death from an infectious disease has to be certified by the medical examiner. So it happens that these very personal things are already on the public record from another source. So this is the other thing that always confused me about it, is that if you're going to let medical records be public, then clearly you don't care about controversial causes of death. right? Like by definition, that's what a medical examiner looks at. So I think some of it was, like projecting onto what people thought seemed intrusive, maybe. I don't
Mhm.
know. It's really strange, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I love that you are raising this issue because I do think that this moment in time with COVID, when the public is really starting to get mad about the concealment of information, why can't I find out if my kid's school has COVID, or why can't I find out if my mother's nursing home has COVID? That there is a chance to actually take back some of the ground that we've lost over the last few decades. That we've been playing defense for so long in this FOI field, and there's a chance to actually play some offense and to identify some high opportunity categories of records like that that never should have been made confidential, and that we can try to claw back.
Yeah, and I guess that was kind of what prompted me on this. Is I feel like we, as a trade in journalism, we give up too easily. We don't revisit it. We never go back and say, wait a minute, you said you were closing it for these purposes. Did you make, why can't we go back at it? Why can't we say that, have we gone too far? And so maybe there's an opt-out system where people could opt out of public disclosure, um, something like that. I don't know, but that wouldn't help the public health people much. But there could also be, I mean, just like federal, and I guess I bring it back to like FEC data, people's names, addresses, home addresses, and and how much they gave to which candidates, all that very, what people consider sensitive information is sitting in public databases with a law that says you can't use this for any purpose other than X, Y, and Z. And there have like never been any cases where people tried to use it for purposes other than X, Y, and Z. It's just like, it just doesn't happen. So I think if you put a law on it and said that it's only be used for these purposes, for research and public and, you know, purposes it can't be used for commercial purposes. Like you can't go give funeral, things, or you can't use lawyers to go back and do like market a family for their material, for services. If you can't use it commercially, then I don't understand why we couldn't just put those kind of restrictions on it. So I agree, though. I think that it's time that we start looking at some of these things that
Yeah.
are closed off. The other category of records that I think maybe there's a moment, just if I can make a case for it to somebody who might listen, the other category of records that I think we might be able to start clawing back are the witness and victim names in police reports now.
Oh,
And
yes.
the reason I say that is that we have now learned we can't believe anything that the police say. So if we always have to have police said this, and we have no ability to get to the other side of the story until it goes to court, then I think people are realizing that there might be usefulness in being able to figure out who the witnesses they spoke to and who the victims were. So I wonder if there are other things that are going on today that might make their argument toward more disclosure more palatable. So
Sir, I'm losing your audio. I'm
yeah, and
losing
I've
your
lost
audio. It's
you. Yeah, I've lost you guys too.
breaking
And
up
I guess we
really
only have,
bad.
well, we're almost done anyway, I think.
I'm going to follow up with you offline.
Okay. Yeah, because we can, we're about done anyway. So,
Thank you for doing that.
okay, great. Nice talking to you, Frank. Thanks for having us do this.
Oh, and can I just ask one last question
Sure.
before we? So after going through the paper itself, it did seem like it was. Is this kind of the beginning of a longer research project? Just because the length did seem you know, it was 13 pages, at least the one that Professor Coolier provided to us. Do you plan to expand upon the research paper, or like use this as a basis to write a more in-depth one going forward?
I think our goal on this is to use this as a jumping off point to actually start getting some action. I don't know that we need to know a lot more about it. Other than that, we believe it should be changed. And it's much more of an advocacy piece than it is a pure research piece.
Oh,
So,
okay. That
and
makes
that's
sense.
why, yeah, this paper thing was pretty wide open in terms of what you wanted to do. And so we felt that just getting some basic research on why were records closed, where are they closed, who wants them closed, who wants them open, just getting that basic research down would give us a jumping off point to be able to start organizing around some attempts to open them back up.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, because that was my main. Just after going through it, I did kind of think this read a little bit less like an in-depth research piece, but that makes
Yeah, it
sense that
wasn't.
this is it's more of an awareness piece than a
Yeah.
research piece.
So I think
Oh,
where
okay.
we go from here is to work with the state FOIA associations, with the press associations, possibly do some opinion pieces off of it. But I think from an academic standpoint, it's not very academic. It's much more of a reported opinion piece in a lot of ways.
Oh, okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, and this definitely kind of opened my eyes to. And I was just surprised at how many states do have closed records. That was a surprise
I
that
know.
jumped out at me. Because it to me, you know, with obituaries and
Right.
genealogy records, and it seems like something that should be very accessible.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Alrighty.
Okay, great. Well, nice talking to you, Sebastian. Good luck with your school.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.